Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere strange, soft, and just a little bit spiky. You're curled under an impossibly heavy Edwardian quilt feathers, pressing your limbs like gentle paperweights, and then from the darkness at your feet, you hear it. A small rhythmic snuffling, maybe a faint sneeze, then prickle. Something has nestled itself near your toes and it is very much alive. No, you're not dreaming, not yet, because tonight we're diving under the eiderdown and into the odd, forgotten world of Edwardian women who took hedgehogs to bed. Yep, not hot water bottles, not yapping lapdogs, actual hedgehogs. Tiny walking pin cushions with an attitude and a surprising list of qualifications, as we'll discover. You probably won't survive this tale with your modern bedtime standards intact. Seriously, if you thought forgetting to plug in your heated blanket was tragic, wait till you meet the Victorian foot warmer that literally exploded if overfilled. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your location and the local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle into the hallway of a dim Edwardian townhouse. It smells like lavender gaslight and faint mildew. It's late past 10. The servants have long retired except maybe one, but even they would only be lurking behind a closed door, hoping not to be summoned. You're in your nightdress, flannel socks, gripping a candle in one hand when there. Just ahead, waddling along the hallway runner, a low-slung, bristly creature on tiny legs. It pauses near the skirting board, nose twitching. It's not a rat. It's a hedgehog. Now, if this were a modern home, you'd be panicking. Googling hedgehog in house, is it dangerous? But here in this Edwardian setting, your heart rate stays flat. You might even nod to it. Maybe you follow, because it's not lost. It knows exactly where it's going. It's going to bed, just like you. You trail the hedgehog down the hallway. It makes a left turn through a cracked door your bedroom. Inside, the scene is rich with textures, thick velvet drapes in dark red, a brocade chaise that no one ever sits on a dressing table, smothered in glass perfume bottles and porcelain brush sets. The fireplace is out. Hasn't been lit in days. The chill hits immediately, a rising cold that seems to creep from the floors upward, a kind of dampness modern insulation would never allow. You rub your arms and look to the bed. It's enormous, all fluff and fringe. Atop it, a modest mound in the lower right corner. You lift the edge of the quilt and peek. There's your snuffling friend already curled in a wool sock, nose tucked in, eyes squinty with pleasure. He's here to work. In Edwardian homes especially, the drafty, unheated kind, common before modern plumbing and radiators. Staying warm at night wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Respiratory diseases were rampant, and one too many chilly nights could snowball into something deadly. Hedgehogs, oddly enough, offered a perfect combination of body heat and vermin control. And unlike a cat, a hedgehog didn't leap on your face mid-dream, or vomit on the hearth rug, or scratch the furniture. He just curled up, snorted occasionally, and generated a small, steady furnace of warmth, one that didn't come with a monthly bill or require kindling. But why are you, the lady of the house, surely sharing a mattress with woodland wildlife? Well, the class lines blur more than you might think. Yes, in grander houses, a hedgehog might have been confined to the servant quarters, kept in kitchens to hunt roaches, or under nursery beds to scare off silverfish. But in middling or rural households where servants were few and bedrooms barely insulated, these humble creatures slowly graduated from rodent hunters to heat sources, like hot bricks or bedpans, only alive and cuter. Some households even raised them from babies, feeding them milk and scraps, letting them toddle across sun-warmed garden paths before training them to settle politely in footlockers or under bedsteads. You sit on the bed and sigh. It's not just physical warmth, it's the company. The subtle breathing of another creature in a world where solitude could stretch long and loud, especially for unmarried women. For some, the hedgehog wasn't just a thermal solution. It was a kind of comfort pet long before that term existed. Of course, this wasn't universal. There were those who found the idea disgusting, dangerous. There were outbreaks of ringworm and fleas. Not every hedgehog was clean or docile. Historians still argue whether Edwardian women kept hedgehogs out of affection or sheer desperation, one dryly notes. Maybe it was both. A mix of pragmatism and companionship, like downloading a dating app just to have someone to split utilities with. There were even recipes. Not for hedgehogs, although. No, we're not going there tonight, but for their upkeep. Old domestic handbooks advised feeding them bread soaked in cream. Some called for mashing bananas. Others warned never to bathe them too often, lest their skin dry and peel like paper beneath a flame. Hedgehog care, like child care, had no rule book. Just advice passed down from lady's maid to lady from aunt to niece. You lie back, the quilt rising to your chin, and you imagine it being cold in that particular, deep into your bones Edwardian way. The kind of cold no fireplace quite dispels. The kind where your breath clouds in the air like a ghost sigh. And then, the quiet warmth of something small and real at your feet, the soft thud of its movement, a presence, a heartbeat not your own. It doesn't solve the world, but it helps the night. The next morning you wake before the sun. That's just how things go in Edwardian England. There's no central heating hum or electric alarm. Just the creak of wood, the tap of a servant's footfall in the corridor, maybe a rooster somewhere deep in the countryside beyond the fogged-up glass. And your hedgehog, still there, still curled in that same sock, his nose barely visible, rising and falling with the slow rhythm of undisturbed sleep. You don't move yet. You listen. Because that hedgehog, unlikely as it seems, is part of a long domestic chain, a centuries-old lineage of creatures enlisted to serve the house not just for cuteness, but for very real, often underappreciated labor. And this is where things get strange. You see, what's keeping animals for warmth or hygiene was not exclusive to the Edwardian period. Long before the invention of space heaters or fluffy electric throws, Europeans found creative ways to weaponize nature against the chill. Romans kept monkeys indoors to sniff out poison. Medieval peasants cuddled goats in shared beds. In 17th century France, nobles hosted lapdogs, whose entire purpose was to function as glorified heat packs. Some were even bred for flat bellies and short legs to better warm the laps of society ladies. But hedgehogs occupied a particularly curious niche. They weren't ornamental, they weren't cuddly in the traditional sense, and they definitely didn't prance around in tiny outfits. Well, not until Victorian postcards got involved, but that's another scandal altogether. No, hedgehogs were working animals, domestic sidekicks, silent prickly roommates. Their talents began in the kitchen, where they hunted beetles, slugs, and crumbs. Then they graduated to pantries where their presence was said to scare off rats, not by violence, but by sheer unsettling weirdness. Because rats, clever as they are, don't like new, unpredictable animals roaming their domain. Eventually, as Edwardian sensibilities grew more comfort-focused, hedgehogs made it to bedrooms. A small heated bundle beneath the blankets that wouldn't catch fire or leak boiling water. You finally sit up and stretch. The air in the room is frosty. Your breath puffs out before you. And for just a moment you wonder how this little creature wild technically ever found its way into such an intimate space. Part of the answer lies in the peculiar charm that surrounded hedgehogs in Edwardian popular culture. While they were never quite domesticated in the modern sense, they were often depicted as charmingly useful. Nature's odd job assistants. Children's books and ladies' columns frequently featured little hedgehog characters, helpful, industrious, adorably grim. You might be surprised to learn that in 1905, a full 6 years before the sinking of the Titanic, Beatrix Potter published The Tale of Mrs. Tiggy Winkle, the story of a hedgehog laundress who lives in a hidden hill iron socks and drinks milk from a thimble. The book was an instant success, and Tiggy Winkle became a minor cultural icon. She was plucky, efficient. She smelled faintly of fresh linen, and she helped shift the public view of hedgehogs from spiky pests to possible pets. Even more surprising, Potter's inspiration came from a real hedgehog. She kept several over the years, often in little enclosures or basket beds. Some scholars debate whether they were true pets or simply study animals, but it's clear she adored their expressions and movements. Her drawings suggest long hours spent observing them, maybe even late into cold nights, when their warmth was more than metaphorical. Historians still argue whether Potter's influence truly normalized hedgehogs in households, or whether she was merely echoing a trend already underway. Either way, you can imagine the scene: an Edwardian mother tucking her child into bed, a candle flickering on the nightstand, and a hedgehog waddling across the floor, met not with screams but with fond coos, and maybe a doll-sized knitted hat. Of course not everyone was thrilled with this arrangement. There were the housekeepers ever concerned about hygiene. A hedgehog might be warm, sure, but he was also prone to leaving droppings the size of coffee beans in inconvenient places. And then there were the medical men, Edwardian doctors with dramatically waxed mustaches, warning about lice, fleas, and untraceable maladies carried by foreign animals. Still, the idea stuck, especially among rural women in lower middle-class households. When you couldn't afford coal and your hot water bottle had cracked one too many times, a hedgehog was a solution, one that didn't argue or need winding up. You dress slowly, reluctant to disturb your bedmate. As you pull on your corset, a contraption that definitely doesn't make mornings easier, you think of how adaptable Edwardian women had to be. Sure, we remember the gowns and the tea dances, but we forget the frostbite, the damp sheets, the months when colds turned into funerals. You needed solutions, you needed survival tricks, and you needed company. A hedgehog wasn't just warm, it was a reminder that something alive shared your space. That in a world often run by men, where women were expected to suffer quietly and keep the house pristine, there was still room for something absurd. Something delightfully non-domestic. Something that said, actually, I will curl up under your skirt, hem and snore. At breakfast, you mentioned the hedgehog to your cousin, a widow from Devon with strong opinions and stronger tea. She nods sagely and says, "Oh yes, I had one once that used to lick the soles of my feet." Oddly pleasant. You both sip your tea and pretend not to be horrified. That's the thing about Edwardian propriety. It was a thin crust over an absolutely bonkers stew of survival tactics and personal rituals. For every silver-plated toast rack, there was a woman quietly sleeping with a hedgehog and not telling her vicar. And that's how this strange bedtime tradition carried on, not as a public practice, but a whispered one. Passed from sister to sister housemaid, to daughter hedgehog to hedgehog. The fire pops. Your cousin sneezes. Somewhere in the distance, another hedgehog begins its morning stretch. By late morning, the house stirs fully to life. Somewhere upstairs, a maid beats dust from the drapes with terrifying vigor, and downstairs toast is burning again, an unfortunate feature of Edwardian stoves. You sit on a fainting couch you've never once fainted on, still marveling at the weird reality of last night. That hedgehog curled at your feet like a living ember in the long, icy dark. But today you're curious. How did this strange little creature, wild, defensive, famously antisocial, become a household presence at all? To answer that, we need to talk about the long, twisty relationship between humans and hedgehogs in British folklore. Says mate, because before they snuck into bedrooms, hedgehogs haunted fields, farms, and bedtime stories. You head to the library, a dusty room no one really uses unless they're hiding from dinner guests or avoiding embroidery practice. Shelves stretch high, their spines cracked, infading their titles ranging from practical farm keeping to dramatic cautionary tales. And somewhere among them you find it, the Country Yearbook of Natural Oddities, 1883 edition. You open to a page and there it is, an engraving of a hedgehog squat and gloriously smug standing atop a pile of apples, impaled on its back like culinary trophies. Of course, hedgehogs don't actually carry apples this way, but that's what people believed for centuries. The myth appears in Roman texts, resurfaces in medieval bestiaries, and persists well into the 1800s that hedgehogs gathered food by rolling through orchards and collecting windfalls on their spines like living shish kebabs. This image cemented their role as both comical and clever trickster animals who lived outside the rules of more respectable fauna. They were part piglet, part porcupine, and 100% folklore gold. One popular 17th century tale involves a hedgehog who outsmarts a fox in a race by convincing his identical twin to stand at the finish line. "I was here before you," says the twin, shocking the fox so thoroughly he falls into a ditch. Moral hedgehogs are sneaky geniuses, or possibly just have great family coordination. This mischievous aura translated into real-world tolerance. Farmers, especially in rural England, saw them as ambiguous creatures, neither wholly good nor evil, but undeniably helpful in the garden. They were credited with eating slugs, controlling insects, and even predicting weather by how early they nested. And yes, historians still argue whether rural families kept hedgehogs out of utility or superstition. Some believed they kept witches away. Others saw them as omens. Kill one, and you might get blight. Spare one and your potatoes would double. Hard science, no. But hedgehogs were never just animals, they were symbols. Living good luck charms with spikes. Your own hedgehog, let's call him Buttons because it suits, his absurdly tiny feet has shuffled out of the bedroom by now and is methodically circling the parlor rug like he's inspecting for flaws in the stitching. You let him, he's earned it, and so had his ancestors. You see, while foxes were cunning and badgers noble and slightly terrifying, hedgehogs were adaptable. They didn't demand territory or dominance. They didn't attack livestock or chew through tools. They lived quietly, ate pests, and required minimal upkeep. In an Edwardian world where efficiency was increasingly prized, where housewives read magazines about domestic optimization, and women were expected to do more with less, hedgehogs were the perfect low-cost solution. Warmth, pest control, folklore charm, and no barking. And they were small, that mattered. You flip another page in the yearbook and find an illustration of a hedgehog kennel, basically a box with straw and a hole in the side. Some ladies' magazines even published DIY guides for building them. Because while dogs needed yards and cats wanted windowsills, hedgehogs were perfectly happy in a shoebox under your dresser. In fact, there's anecdotal evidence of women training hedgehogs to follow simple routines. A diary from 1910 mentions a hedgehog named Crumpet who would only fall asleep once the chamber pot lid was closed, why no one knows. Possibly just dramatic flair. You glance at Buttons, who has now paused beside the coal scuttle and seems to be contemplating the fire irons. He's not trying to escape. He's not even particularly interested in you. But he's present, and in a time when emotional support was rarely discussed, when women were expected to soldier on through melancholy exhaustion or the peculiar dread of being unmarried at 30, a quiet companion had value. Let's not forget, Edwardian Britain was obsessed with emotional control. Displays of distress were frowned upon. A crying woman might be diagnosed with nerves and recommended for smelling salts or rest cures. But a woman who quietly shared her bed with a hedgehog, she was eccentric at worst. At best, she was practical. Of course, this raised eyebrows among some clergymen and columnists. The embrace of the brute one, sniffed in a 1908 Household Digest, signals the collapse of moral uprightness. Apparently, letting a hedgehog under the sheets was a slippery slope to bohemianism, bare ankles, and possibly jazz. Still, the trend spread. One woman might have picked it up from a country aunt, another from a cheeky letter printed in a lady's circular, yet another after overhearing a conversation in the apothecary queue. The instructions were usually the same: keep the animal clean, feed it milk-soaked bread, and let it burrow near your toes. It will find its spot. They always do. You stretch your legs and consider how different things feel now. You've moved from bewildered to fond, even defensive. Buttons isn't just a quirk of the past, he's a link. A reminder that women have always found their own comfort in strange private ways. Some knit, some write secret poetry, some tuck a hedgehog into bed and sleep better knowing something else in the room is alive, warm, and completely uninterested in their social status. And honestly, that might be the most comforting thing of all. Afternoon sun slants through the high parlor windows, catching motes of dust that float like lazy stars. You trail your hand along the top of a sideboard cluttered with family photos, half-burnt candles, and a porcelain figure of Queen Alexandra that no one remembers buying. Buttons is asleep again beneath an armchair. This time, paws tucked, bristles gently expanding and contracting with each breath. You lower yourself into a chair that was clearly made for posture, not comfort, and find your mind drifting to a bigger question. What kind of woman was most likely to sleep with a hedgehog? The answer might not be what you think. See, we tend to picture Edwardian women as living in two categories: grand ladies in velvet gowns reclining on chaise lounges, or soot-streaked scullery maids elbow-deep in laundry suds. But there was a vast, complicated middle: governesses, teachers, unmarried sisters, widows, typists, shop girls, each one navigating a delicate balance between propriety and survival. And it's here in this liminal domestic space that hedgehogs thrived. Start with the one spinster. The term was already fading in favor of single lady, but the connotation hadn't improved. A woman over 30 without a husband. Society saw her as a question mark, a curiosity. Her time was no longer spoken of in the language of courtships and futures. but of routines and self-sufficiency. A hedgehog in that context wasn't just warm, it was defiance. Because while married women had bed warmers in the form of husbands, affectionate or not, and the rich had copper hot water bottles and double-thick down the spinster, had herself, and if she was clever, a hedgehog. One who wouldn't judge her if she wore the same flannel nightgown 3 winters running or read sensation novels by candlelight. Historians still argue whether these women adopted hedgehogs out of genuine affection or symbolic resistance. But the result was the same. A hedgehog meant she wasn't entirely alone. Then you had the country widows, especially the ones living just close enough to town to get daily post, but far enough out to be forgotten by their richer cousins. With the pension from a late husband trickling in and no children left at home, companionship grew scarce. Many kept animals for both function and feeling hens, with names cats that only responded to insults and yes, hedgehogs, who burrowed into crocheted Afghans at bedtime. A diary from 1907 recounts one such woman in Suffolk, who found it preferable to speak nightly with Myrtle the hedgehog than engage in letters to my sister who was a bore. You grin at that. Some things don't change. And then there were maids, especially those in large, drafty houses where rooms were repurposed for storage and corridors stretched like unlit tunnels. While forbidden from having pets, officially, some tucked hedgehogs into dresser drawers, wrapped in torn bits of lace and leftover wool. They needed them not only for warmth, but because the quiet, stubborn little creatures became confidants in a world that didn't pause to ask how they felt. Imagine it after a 14-hour shift of silver polishing and coal hauling. A hedgehog snuffle beside your ear might be the only soft sound meant just for you. One fringe account from a 1911 letter describes a chambermaid in Norfolk who trained her hedgehog to nudge her awake at dawn by licking her knuckles. Practical, possibly exaggerated, but it speaks to how deeply integrated these animals became in the emotional lives of women. Of course, not all hedgehog keepers were low income or isolated. Enter the heroine-centric aristocrat. Every generation had them. The unmarried duchess who bred Peking cheese in her music room, the countess who refused to wear gloves unless they'd been blessed by her parrot, and naturally the marchioness who slept with 2 hedgehogs, one on each foot for circulatory purposes. There's an account in a 1909 Society column of Lady Henrietta G., who arrived at a weekend party with a velvet-lined hat box containing a hedgehog named Percival. When questioned, she reportedly said, "He's better company than half the men here." You can't argue with that. Still, even these women were using hedgehogs as both comfort and commentary, a sly nod to how Edwardian gender roles constrained emotional expression. In an era where women were supposed to smile politely, never sweat and faint, only for romantic reasons, a hedgehog was a pocket-sized rebellion. It didn't care for etiquette. It hissed when annoyed, napped when bored, and didn't expect small talk. And there's something deeply appealing about that. You look down. Buttons is twitching in his sleep, possibly dreaming of a particularly irritating beetle. And you wonder, as so many women surely did before you, what it means to form such a quiet, strange bond with a creature so utterly indifferent to status, fashion, or social scripts. Because in a world where women were constantly asked to shrink themselves to fit into corsets, to lower their voices to not appear too clever, a hedgehog took up space unapologetically. It required softness, but not sentimentality. It thrived in silence. It made no demands except warmth and occasional milk. And in return, it offered something rare, uncomplicated presence. Even Queen Victoria, though she died just before the Edwardian period began, was rumored to have kept a hedgehog in her menagerie at Osborne House. Though she never wrote about it directly, a courtier's note mentions a small prickled beast that alarmed the Dachshunds and pleased Her Majesty, a phrase that could describe half the royal family. As you make your way back upstairs, you pause outside your own bedroom door, fingers grazing the frame. You open it quietly and peek in. Buttons somehow has migrated onto your pillow. He looks absurd, and also entirely right, because whether you were a spinster in Bristol or a dowager in Derbyshire, a maid with cracked knuckles or a novelist with frizzy hair, sharing your bed with a hedgehog wasn't just about heat, it was about having something in your life that was yours. Narration, not rented, not approved by your father, not dictated by the whims of Parliament or the gaze of a chaperone. Just yours. One small thing in a spiky world that didn't ask you to apologize for taking up space. Night falls earlier than it should, and you find yourself lighting the oil lamp on your dressing table with the kind of theatrical sigh that suggests you've read too many Gothic novels. The flame wavers and catches, casting a honey glow over your room's faintly cluttered charm, crocheted pillows, a chipped chamber pot, an alarm clock that ticks too loudly but never keeps time. And at the foot of the bed, there he is, buttons doing slow rotations like a roast on a very indecisive spit. Tonight, let's talk about the most obvious thing. Why not just use a hot water bottle? Seriously, why adopt a living pincushion to share your sheets when technology already had the answer? Here's where things get a bit more layered. Because yes, Edwardians had hot water bottles. By the 1890s, most middle-class homes could afford them, and they came in various forms: copper, ceramic, rubber. Some were shaped like bricks, others like elongated teapots, and a few particularly ambitious designs looked disturbingly like human torsos. You'd fill them with scalding water from the kettle, wrap them in flannel, and tuck them under the blankets an hour before bed. And they worked for about an hour. The problem: they cooled down fast. And unless you had a maid willing to trudge back down to the scullery at 2 a.m. to reheat the kettle, and you were comfortable enough waking her with a bell, you were left with a lukewarm slab pressing against your ankle, like the ghost of warmth past. By contrast, a hedgehog stayed warm all night. The average hedgehog's body temperature hovers around 35 Kelvin, 95, and it radiates heat in a way that's surprisingly soothing, like a small breathing ember, consistent and comforting. And unlike a ceramic bottle, it responds to you, adjusts, nuzzles into the crook of your knee, or tucks itself behind your back like a woolly comma. It also doesn't burst. That might sound silly, but hot water bottle explosions were not rare. An improperly sealed stopper or brittle rubber could lead to sudden scalding disaster. Newspapers from the period include scattered horror stories of midnight injuries. One man in Yorkshire reportedly woke with blistered thighs and a boiled cat. The cat survived. The hot water bottle did not. So, in an ironic twist, the hedgehog's spines and all was often safer than the modern alternative. Plus, let's be honest, a hedgehog has personality. A ceramic jug does not. It doesn't grunt softly when you shift or scratch at the blanket, or make little wheezing noises that sound like a Victorian kettle's dying breath. You can't name a hot water bottle, Myrtle. Well, you could, but it wouldn't blink back at you with sleepy disdain. Still, historians debate whether practicality was really the driving force, or whether this was more about emotional projection, about companionship in the soft, flickering dark. Remember, this was a period of change. Electricity was creeping into homes, but unevenly. Gaslighting was still common. Central heating existed, but mostly in public buildings or very rich houses. For many Edwardian women, especially outside major cities, nighttime still meant literal darkness, patchy warmth, and deep, unbroken silence. A silence that could get loud. This was also a time when sleep hygiene didn't really exist as a concept. You slept when it got dark, woke with the sun or the rooster, and spent the hours in between either reading, praying, worrying, or if you were unlucky, listening to the sounds of your own digestion in an otherwise motionless house. A hedgehog changed the script. It rustled, it shifted, it reminded you that you weren't alone in the dark. In fact, some women reportedly talked to their hedgehogs out before bed. Not in a cutesy cartoon character voice, but like you might talk to a cat who doesn't care what you say but still listens. They'd recap the day, mull over social slights, whisper secrets. If you've ever caught yourself narrating your feelings to a goldfish or apologizing to a houseplant, you understand this instinct. It's not about the response, it's about release. And speaking of releases, let's touch on the one unglamorous reality people always raise. What about the smell? The mess. Truth, hedgehogs are surprisingly clean. Unlike rats or ferrets, they don't emit a strong scent unless stressed. Their fastidious groomers tend to pick one corner to do their business, and when kept warm and well-fed, don't make much noise at all. Still, Edwardian women took precautions. Hedgehogs were often given little linen under blankets, hand-washed and hung by the stove, stitched with initials like tiny trousseaux. Some even wore miniature fabric pouches to keep their feet warm and contain the inevitable nighttime accidents. Think of it as the hedgehog equivalent of Victorian footy pajamas. And if one made a mess, that's what vinegar water and elbow grease were for. As one 1904 ladies' column advised, the price of nocturnal comfort is the occasional laundering of the hearth mat. Truer words. As you lean over to blow out the lamp, you glance at Buttons. His eyes flick open just enough to confirm that you're not offering food, then close again with majestic indifference. You smile. Because tonight, like so many women before you, you've chosen something strange and stubborn and real to share your quiet hours with. Not a convenience, not a trend, a being. One that never tries to fix you, never asks for more than you can give, never tells you to smile. Just warmth, presence, and the occasional grumble if you roll over too loudly. Tomorrow the water pipes might freeze. The maid might burn the toast again. Someone might suggest you should marry your cousin Edgar before your prospects wither entirely. But tonight, you sleep beside a hedgehog, and that's enough. The fire has burned down to a gentle red eye in the hearth, casting soft, wobbly shadows across the wallpaper. You lie on your side, one hand tucked under your cheek, the other gently resting on the little lump curled beside you. Buttons gives a half snuffle, pressing his paws against your hip, like he's trying to hold you in place. Tonight, your thoughts drift toward the curious web of rituals and superstitions that grew around the act of bringing a hedgehog to bed. Because for many Edwardian women, it wasn't just a habit, it was a kind of ceremony. You didn't just plop a hedgehog onto the coverlet like a hot pastry. No. There was a rhythm, a preparation, a set of unspoken rules passed down through whispered conversations and shared experience. These weren't always written down, but they were known. For example, you never put a hedgehog directly on the mattress? That was considered bad luck. Instead, a folded cloth, a bit of flannel, or a faded handkerchief was always placed beneath him to lift his dreams, as one superstition phrased it. Some women swore that if the hedgehog's belly touched the bare bed, you'd have bad dreams or worse, wake with an uninvited visitor, which sounds like a euphemism for a ghost, a debt collector, or Aunt Maud. You chuckle under your breath. Still, you fold the flannel anyway, just in case. There was also a belief, especially in Yorkshire and along the Devon coast, that hedgehogs could take in a person's worries overnight, that their compact little forms were like spiritual blotters absorbing stress through proximity. In the morning, if the hedgehog was extra fidgety or grumpy, it was seen as a sign it had done its job. Of course, the historians still debate whether this idea was rooted in folklore or born from Victorian-era spiritualism bleeding into early Edwardian thought. But regardless of origin, the result was the same: women started assigning emotional weight to their evening routines. Some would whisper anxieties to their hedgehogs as if handing over a list of errands. Others rubbed a finger along the creature's back 3 times clockwise, never counterclockwise, believing it would turn the day backward and undo any mistakes. It didn't, obviously, but it felt like it might. And in a world where women had so little agency over their day-to-day lives, even a placebo was a form of rebellion. Take the hedgehog blessing ritual, which popped up sporadically in ladies' journals around 1910. A small circle of unmarried women, usually in villages or small towns, would gather on the new moon, each bringing her own hedgehog. They'd share cakes, light tallow candles, and take turns wishing on the quills. Most wishes were modest warmth through the winter, fewer chilblains, a new bodice without holes. Occasionally, someone would ask for something riskier, like the courage to ignore her father's opinion on suitors. Scandalous. These gatherings were small, private, and rarely lasted more than a few months before fizzling out or being absorbed into a sewing circle. But they speak to a larger truth. Hedgehogs weren't just functional. They were focal points for tiny secret acts of selfhood. The rituals could also be surprisingly elaborate. In a letter discovered in an attic in Brighton, a governess wrote of preparing Mr. Pickle's chamber each night with the precision of a high priestess. She laid out a square of muslin, spritzed lightly with lavender water, and aligned it just left of my navel for symmetry. She placed beside it a breadcrumb as an offering and sang a single verse of "Abide with Me," though she freely admitted Mr. Pickles was an atheist. You shake your head, grinning. Sleep-deprived women in drafty houses will invent the most tender nonsense. Still, even that absurdity hides something quietly powerful. Because rituals create boundaries, they give shape to time. And in an era when many women's days were structured entirely around other people's needs, breakfasts for fathers, schedules for children, calls for husbands, The bedtime hedgehog ritual was one of the few things they controlled entirely. And it wasn't always gentle. One former ladies' companion interviewed much later in 1940 admitted that she used to whisper insults into her hedgehog's ears. "I'd call him all the things I wanted to say to Lady Marchbank. You pompous twillock, you joyless bit of pudding." He never minded. I think he understood. This was a time when anger in women was seen as pathological. Hysteria, nervous collapse, neurasthenia. But if you let that anger slip out in the form of a mock argument with a spiny roommate, no harm done. Another odd belief that hedgehogs could catch dreams. If a woman woke from a nightmare, she was advised to press her hand to the hedgehog's back palm down. Supposedly, the dream would ground out through the spines and dissipate. It's absurd, and somehow weirdly plausible at 2 a.m. when your heart is thumping and the rain sounds like footsteps. You stretch your legs, feeling the satisfying resistance of flannel sheets. Buttons shifts, emitting a sound halfway between a wheeze and a burp. You reach down and rest your fingers against his side, feeling the soft drum beat of life in that tiny rib cage. No prayer, no poem, just presence. There were other symbols too. Hedgehogs were considered protectors against malevolent spirits, a holdover from much older British folklore where they were believed to ward off witches' curses and ill omens. Some women placed a tiny acorn or charm under the hedgehog's cloth each night to amplify the protection. Others stitched initials into the hedgehog's bedding, believing it bound the creature to their luck. And if a woman had a series of particularly good days, no burns, no awkward proposals, no mother-in-law visits, she might leave a tiny saucer of sugared milk as a thank you gift. Buttons would appreciate that. As you drift toward sleep, it's this blend of domestic routine and quiet myth that wraps around you like an extra quilt. Because no matter how rational we believe ourselves to be, we crave small magic. We seek it in talismans and patterns, in the curl of a warm hedgehog pressing against the curve of our belly. And that's not silly. It's ancient. It's human. You wake in the dark just for a moment to the sensation of tiny feet rearranging themselves against your thigh. Buttons is repositioning grumpily, you assume probably because you've hogged the blanket. You smile without opening your eyes, let your hand fall limply to rest near him and drift back into the thick syrup of sleep. But if you could stay awake a little longer, you'd remember that you meant to think about something else tonight. Something not quite discussed in polite society but known quietly among Edwardian women. Loneliness. It hung in drawing rooms like heavy curtains. It padded across hallway rugs in the middle of the night. And it crawled under bed sheets with the weight of a life unlived. For many women in the Edwardian era, especially the unmarried as the hedgehog, was more than warmth or ritual, it was company. See, the world was changing fast. Men were leaving villages for cities. Marriages were delayed or discarded altogether. The suffrage movement was rising, yes, but so too were expectations to remain proper, modest, deferent. Women could work, but not too visibly. They could speak, but not too loudly. And they could certainly not admit to feeling hollow or scared or bone-achingly alone. Historians still argue whether unmarried Edwardian women were lonelier than their predecessors or simply more aware of it. But one thing's certain, they weren't short on silence. Hedgehogs filled that silence. Not in the way a friend does, or a child, or a lover, but in their own quiet, grounding way. They asked nothing. They didn't judge, they were there. And in a time before electric clocks hummed on bedside tables, before late-night radio gave you something to listen to, before you could scroll through other people's lives from under your quilt, having a creature beside you. A creature who needed you just enough but not too much was a kind of emotional scaffolding. Evenings could stretch on forever. If you were a governess, you might have worked all day wrangling other people's children, then eaten supper alone with a book and tepid broth. If you were a widow young or old, you might have spent your afternoon darning socks no longer needed returning letters you wouldn't receive replies to. If you were a spinster daughter still living at home, perhaps you spent the evening smiling vaguely at your father's newspaper while pretending not to overhear your mother's fretting about your prospects. Then you climbed the stairs, 1 step, 2 steps, holding the candle aloft, the flickering shadows stretching longer than your years. And there, waiting in a shoebox padded with wool, would be your companion. Sometimes women named their hedgehogs after authors. Bronte Elliot Wilde, though those were usually the ones who kept journals. Others preferred food names, crumpet, treacle, fig. One woman in Eastbourne reportedly called hers Tuesday because Tuesday is the most intolerable day of the week, and he makes it slightly less so. There was something in that act of naming, of tending, of placing the creature gently under the quilt each night that bordered on defiance. You couldn't choose your family. You couldn't always choose your future. But you could choose to share your bed with a warm, grumpy, loyal bundle of fur and spikes. And it made a difference. One medical pamphlet from 1909 even acknowledged what it called the Montcalm Minor psychological benefits of small domesticated companions. It wasn't exactly warm endorsement, but it recognized that many women's lives were structured around obligation and restriction, and that animals, even unconventional ones, offered a kind of mental release. Even the physical weight of a hedgehog on your leg was affirming. Something pressing down, something real. Because the great terror of solitude isn't the absence of conversation, it's the absence of witnessing. No one saw you roll your eyes at that joke earlier. No one noticed how lovely your hair looked this afternoon in the sun. No one laughed when you laughed or sighed when you did. But Buttons saw you get into bed. He blinked when you groaned about the cold. He snorted, probably not in agreement, but you could pretend. And that was enough. You see, Edwardian hedgehog keeping wasn't only for spinsters or widows either. Young married women, especially those without children, often kept a bed hog, particularly if their husbands were away traveling. One diary entry from a newlywed in 1911 reads, "George has gone to Liverpool for 3 weeks. I've brought Bramble upstairs again, despite my mother-in-law's horror. He's quieter than George and doesn't snore." That might sound like a jab. It probably was. But it's also an act of affection, a kind of survival. There's a softness to the relationships Edwardian women had with their hedgehogs that resist mockery. These weren't punchlines or eccentricities, they were subtle rebellions against emotional starvation. And yes, they were also warm. But if warmth were the only goal, they'd have stuck to bedpans and bricks. No, this was about comfort. The kind you don't plug in or button up, the kind you reach for instinctively even when you're not fully aware you need it. It's hard to admit even today when we're surrounded by noise and connectivity that something as small and quiet as a hedgehog could make such a difference. But lie there now and feel the slow rhythm of his breath against your side. He isn't solving anything. He doesn't fix your worries. But he's here, and that's enough. Just as it was for all the women before you, laying in cottages, in terraces, in manors, and attic rooms, whispering into the dark. Still with me? A faint shuffle, a familiar warmth. Yes, always. You don't remember falling asleep, but you know it's early morning now. Not because of any alarm, those haven't been invented yet, at least not in this version of the story, but because the chill has crept back in. That particular pre-dawn hush sits heavy on the house. Even the floorboards are quiet as if they're holding their breath. And Buttons is gone. But don't panic, he hasn't run off or been snatched by some night spirit. He's just moved. Nestled himself under the hem of the blanket near your knees, the way hedgehogs sometimes do when they get too warm or annoyed by your snoring. This moment, this quiet, somewhat absurd realization, would have been deeply familiar to thousands of Edwardian women who each night shared their beds with a hedgehog. Because even though these creatures were constant companions, they were also famously independent. That independence is exactly what shaped the way women talked and often didn't talk about their little roommates. You see, the Edwardian era wasn't exactly bursting with open emotional language. It wasn't the done thing to write long letters about your feelings toward your spiny bedfellow, nor to wax poetic about your affection in polite company. Even within households, hedgehogs were often referred to with a sort of fond euphemism: the night guest, my little lodger, the whispering burr. So how did women express their affection, their attachment, their genuine reliance on these creatures? Through Fordnum, artifactsum. One of the most overlooked corners of Edwardian history isn't in the textbooks, it's in the keepsake boxes, the embroidery hoops, the lockets tucked away in dresser drawers. Some women kept tiny hedgehog portraits, minuscule watercolor studies done on the backs of business cards, sometimes with names scrawled underneath Mr. Tottle Hazel Burr. One woman even sent hers off to a professional illustrator in Bath, who returned a shockingly detailed rendering, complete with the caption, "My Bristle Prince." These weren't meant for public display. They were tucked into journals, pinned inside folding screens, or carried discreetly in handbags. Quiet mementos of something warm and breathing. And then there was the needlework. Oh, the embroidery. You'd be amazed how many seemingly harmless floral patterns stitched carefully into pillowcases and handkerchiefs concealed hidden hedgehogs. Tucked among bluebells curled into roses, stitched in brown thread between thorny vines. Not quite public declarations, but not private either. An inside joke with oneself. There's even an existing sampler dated 1908, where the alphabet ends not with C, but with a dainty little hedgehog and the initials JM stitched beside it. Historians argue whether it was a code for a lover's name or simply just mine. And those fringe women, the artists, the early bohemians, the misfits who hosted salons in dusty townhouses, they did speak about their hedgehogs. A few brave souls even published poems. Terrible ones mostly. Titles like To My Quiet Spike and Bedtime Is Not Lonely When You Are There. But they're touching in their sincerity. One poet, Clemency Harper Watts, famously wrote, "You are no cat to curl and purr, nor dog to chase the stick. But in your breath, I find a pulse that keeps my own heart quick." Admittedly, a bit dramatic for a 400-gram mammal with bad eyesight. But then again, maybe not. Because what these women were trying to capture through verse thread ink was presence. And when presence is rare, when you're not used to being seen or listened to or cared for, even the quietest companionship becomes monumental. Historians still puzzle over the extent to which these animal relationships were romanticized versus real. Some claim the hedgehog was simply symbolic, a metaphor for resistance or domesticity. Others insist they were genuine attachments, not unlike the emotional support animals we talk about today. You suspect it was both. And we see more evidence in the objects these women left behind. A few hedgehog owners made tiny furniture. Not in a ridiculous dollhouse sense, but practical stuff. Little baskets lined with velvet napkin-sized quilts. Even miniature beds made from carved matchboxes. They weren't meant to impress anyone. They were made with care, because care is what women poured into the cracks of their lives. When everything else was rigid, scheduled, and dictated, care was something they could offer on their own terms. Buttons shifts again beneath the covers, doing his morning stretch. The full-body hedgehog splay paws to the side, mouth opening in a yawn so wide it looks like he's trying to swallow the moon. You feel it through the bedding like a little tremor of life. That twitch, that tiny expression of being, is why some women even left inheritance clauses for their hedgehogs. You heard that right. A handful of wills, mostly belonging to spinsters of modest wealth, contained explicit instructions for the care and housing of their hedgehogs after death. A woman in Lancashire left a small annuity to her maid, so long as she see to the care and contentment of Mervyn the hedge. Another bequeathed her hedgehog to a niece with all accessories and the embroidered pillow, so long as she promised not to place him below the knee. That clause sparked a minor family dispute. Mervyn survived it. It wasn't just sentimentality, it was legacy. In a world that left so many women out of formal power, making provisions for a hedgehog was a way of asserting control, of saying I mattered, and so did he. And isn't that what we all want in the end? To be remembered not just for what we endured or what we achieved, but for what we loved quietly, fiercely, and with a kind of stubborn hope. You reach down again and feel Button's warm little lump beneath the blanket. He stirs but doesn't move away. Maybe in his own hedgehog way, he remembers the hands that came before yours. All the other women across all those other nights who whispered little kindnesses and tucked him in like he was a prince. And now it's your turn. The room is still, but the light outside has softened into that pale silver gray, what the Edwardians called chamber light. It's the in-between time, not quite morning, but no longer night, and for a moment you lie there and feel nothing but the steady presence of a hedgehog at your hip. It's easy to forget in this cozy cocoon of quilts and quiet that not everyone in Edwardian society approved of this particular bedtime habit. In fact, quite a few people, mostly men with opinions no one asked for, were actively horrified. You're not shocked, though. Let's be honest, the Venn diagram of people who hated hedgehogs and people who thought corsets should be worn while gardening is basically a circle. Still, there's something distinctly amusing about the way certain gentlemen columnists lost their minds over the creeping scourge of housebound beasts. One letter to The Times in 1905 breathlessly warns that if women continue to treat vermin as pets We shall soon be dining with rats. Bold leap, Reginald. Others framed it as a moral failing, a deviation from proper domestic behavior. According to some etiquette guides, the very presence of non-canine creatures in one's sleeping quarters was a sign of declining hygiene and character. One even suggested that a lady who admitted to bedding down with a hedgehog likely indulges in pagan tendencies, which is a Victorian way of saying probably does yoga and eats lentils. Historians still argue whether this backlash was driven by genuine public health fears or simply another way to control women's behavior. Because while men were allowed to keep hunting dogs indoors or even parrots in the parlor, women were supposed to limit their affections to lace and teacups. But women as ever had other ideas. Many leaned into the scandal, if you can believe it. Some played coy, mentioning their prickly companions in postcards with a little drawing in the corner. Others leaned full satire. One well-known hostess in Oxford kept a hedgehog in a miniature pram and introduced him at parties as Sir Burr of Bedfordshire. But not all resistance was cheeky. Some women simply ignored the criticism and carried on. Because the truth was, no matter how loudly society scoffed, no one could argue with a good night's sleep. And no one could take away what the hedgehog represented: control. You had no say in who visited your parlor or whether your brother inherited the house while you got the piano. But your bed, that was yours. And who or what you chose to keep in it was a small act of rebellion. That's not to say hedgehogs were totally immune from scrutiny. As interest in them grew, especially in urban homes, so did concerns from a new kind of critic, the early animal welfare movement. You might expect these folks to be pro-hedgehog. And in many ways they were. They published guidelines for proper feeding, discouraged overhandling, and warned against decorative grooming. Yes, apparently someone tried to bleach their hedgehog spikes to match the curtains. Don't do that. But there was tension. Some argued that domestication itself was unkind, that a wild animal, however adaptable, belonged in the garden, not the bedroom. That domestic hedging, as they called it, was a selfish indulgence. You can see their point. A hedgehog left to his own devices prefers cool soil and midnight beetles to flannel sheets and spoon-fed egg yolk. And yet the hedgehogs themselves, at least the ones written about, drawn, remembered, didn't seem to mind all that much. Perhaps it was the warmth. Perhaps it was the routine. Or perhaps, like their human bedmates, they were just trying to carve out a little safety in a world that rarely offered it. Some women did release their hedgehogs back into the wild after winter, a sort of seasonal cohabitation. Others kept them for life. When one passed on, another might take its place. Not as a replacement, but as a continuation. A soft thread through years that otherwise blurred together. And when they died, because of course they did as all creatures do, many were mourned with genuine aching grief. There are records of hedgehog burials in back gardens marked with stones or engraved tin plaques. One diary entry from 1912 reads simply, "Bramble died in his sleep. I kissed his nose and wrapped him in my shawl. It's raining now. Feels right." Some women wrote little epitaphs. Others stitched hedgehog shapes into their mourning gloves. One even pressed a single spike into the wax seal of every letter she sent for a year. It's strange, isn't it, how something so small could mean so much? But maybe that's the point. The hedgehog had to be small. It had to be quiet. If it were big and loud and obvious, someone would have taken it away. Or worse, rebranded. It is something respectable, something proper, something masculine. But by staying humble, by tucking under blankets and nestling into baskets, the hedgehog stayed safe. Both literally and symbolically, it became a secret emblem. You know how today people wear rainbow pins or tattoos with semicolons to quietly signal who they are and what they've survived? In Edwardian times, maybe keeping a hedgehog was its own kind of badge. A whisper that said, "I need softness, and I am brave enough to admit it." So tonight when you reach for buttons, when you gently scoop him from the tangle of sheets and settle him near your collarbone, remember, you're part of a legacy, not just of women and their pets, but of unapologetic tenderness, of finding comfort in forbidden places, of loving something even when the world says you shouldn't. And as Buttons shuffles, yawns, and finally curls himself into a tiny comma against your chest, you feel it, the quiet strength of all those other women breathing through the night. Buttons is asleep again, folded into his classic hedgehog swirl. Snout-tucked paws vanish to breathing ball of bristles. And you're back in that heavy-lidded pre-dream haze where your limbs feel like they've turned to honey and the world hums just softly enough to keep your thoughts floating instead of sinking. But don't drift off just yet. We've got a curious little mystery to untangle. Because while it's easy to romanticize all this hedgehog's rebellion, bedtime companionship, it wasn't always sweetness and satin sheets. There were practical complications. And one of the strangest was this. No one could quite figure out where all the hedgehogs were coming from. Seriously, Edwardian women were tucking into bed with these spiny companions across cities and countrysides alike, yet few people were actively breeding them. Hedgehogs weren't being sold at pet shops in neat rows beside songbirds and fancy mice. So how did so many households, especially middle-class ones, end up with one? Well, the answer's weirdly complex and maybe just a little magical. To begin with, there was a robust, informal hedgehog sharing network. Picture this. A woman's hedgehog has babies adorably squeaky pink-bellied little things that wobble like confused cotton balls. She gives one to her sister. The sister keeps it for a season, then passes it to a cousin. That cousin moves to Manchester and the hedgehog ends up living in a boarding house above a stationery shop. One animal, 8 beds, 15 names. These hedgehog adoptions weren't tracked formally, but journals and letters hint at the practice. Some women even wrote thank you notes for their new hedgehog as if they'd been gifted a particularly stylish hat. Others found their companions the old-fashioned way by rescuing them. A surprising number of Edwardian hedgehogs began their human lives after being found injured or disoriented in a garden beside a railway track. Even once in a church nave, he wandered in during evensong and was politely escorted out by the vicar's daughter. But one of the most whispered about sources, the Hedgehog Ladies. You're going to love this. They weren't a formal club, but they might as well have been. A loose, half-secret network of older women who, for reasons of their own, cultivated hedgehogs in their homes or gardens, and then distributed them quietly, sometimes with a nod, sometimes with a short note tucked under a ribbon. Think of them as the underground dealers of Edwardian comfort. Most of these women had long retired from social expectations. Some were widowed, others never married. They wore heavy boots and practical smocks, grew rhubarb, and were unbothered by local gossip. A few were believed to talk to hedgehogs in rhyme. One woman near Dover was said to own 11 at once, each named after a member of Queen Victoria's extended family. And while none of this was criminal, it did exist in a kind of legal gray area. Hedgehogs weren't exactly contraband, but keeping wild ones indoors, especially in certain counties, was considered a bit improper. There were bylaws, pest control ordinances, pages in dusty city codes that technically forbade the harboring of verminous animals within shared lodgings. Historians still debate whether these laws were ever enforced or just quietly ignored. Either way, the Hedgehog Ladies were careful. They didn't advertise. If you wanted one of their animals, you had to be introduced by a friend, a cousin, someone trustworthy. You might get a knock on your kitchen door one foggy evening and open it to find a short woman in a shawl holding a basket. She'd hand it over, mutter something about warmth and responsibility, and disappear into the mist. And in the basket, a curled-up, drowsy hedgehog, and possibly a hand-sewn pamphlet titled Basic Hedgehog Management for Nighttime Comfort. It wasn't just whimsy. These women had standards. They refused to give hedgehogs to anyone who kept cats too noisy or who had strong perfume habits. Hedgehogs hate lavender oil, apparently, or who smoked indoors. They were blunt about it, too. One letter reads, I don't care if your uncle's a lord. If you put powder on your sheets, you don't get pip. The legacy of the Hedgehog Ladies survives in little traces, margin notes in housekeeping journals, family stories passed down like bedtime fables. Some claim they inspired early animal rescue organizations. Others think they were just kindly eccentrics who understood the human need for softness. Either way, you've got to admire the system, because here's what it really was. A quiet infrastructure of care. Woman-led, built on nothing but trust and bristles. In a society that prized formality, they made something messy, spiny, and warm, and let it thrive. Your own buttons may very well be the great-great-grand spike of one of their hedgehogs. Who knows, maybe the lineage goes back to a basket passed across a threshold one chilly evening in 1902. And isn't that kind of wonderful? That under all the policies and parlor rules and stiff collars, Something as tender and peculiar as a hedgehog rescue network managed to flourish. It's like finding a secret garden in the middle of a train station. You turn slightly careful not to jostle buttons and pull the blanket higher. A breeze tiptoes in through the cracked window, but your bed is warm, safe, and maybe you're part of the network now too. Outside, the wind whispers along the edges of the old windows, drawing invisible lines in the darkness. But inside, you're wrapped in a stillness that feels earned. Your breathing matches Button's tiny snores. The room is safe, sacred even. And while you lie there feeling more hedgehog than human yourself, curled quiet, blissfully detached, it's time to talk about something that doesn't quite match the coziness of your cotton pillowcase under Mon. Chuckantini. Because nothing in Edwardian life, not even sleeping with a hedgehog, could escape the long bony fingers of class. It's easy to imagine that the hedgehog craze was purely a middle or upper class quirk, something reserved for women with brocade headboards and embroidered linen. And yes, in many cases it was. A lot of written records, diaries, etiquette books, articles come from women with the time and literacy to document their bedtime fauna. But the full story, it's slipperier than that. Working class women had hedgehogs too. And for them, the hedgehog wasn't just a companion or a cute heat source. It was part of a practical, overlapping network of domestic survival strategies. Not to mention a subtle assertion of independence. Take, for example, the laundress who kept a hedgehog in a drawer to warm her hands after a long shift scrubbing in cold water, or the seamstress in Liverpool who reportedly trained hers to wake her at dawn by nosing her chin a sort of organic alarm clock with spikes, or the shop girl who smuggled hers into a boarding house under the ruse of he's just a rather hairy pincushion. There are even whispered stories of hedgehogs being used to protect coin purses at night. Apparently, if you hid your money pouch under a particularly grumpy hedgehog, your nosy roommates were less likely to go treasure hunting. That's Button's sleep aid and anti-theft system. And while some of these accounts veer into folklore, like the tale of the butcher's daughter whose hedgehog barked at ghosts, they still point to a bigger truth: hedgehogs weren't limited to high society. They just meant different things in different beds. In the parlors of the well-to-do, a hedgehog might be framed as an eccentric luxury. In the back rooms of tenements, it was a creative solution. That said, class lines did affect how society reacted. When a duchess had a hedgehog in her boudoir, quirky, charming a column in Tatler. When a kitchen maid had one, unsanitary, backward, possibly illegal. Historians still argue whether this double standard was about actual hygiene concerns or just another way of reinforcing social hierarchy. Either way, it was glaring. And yet across class boundaries, women kept choosing hedgehogs. That's the quiet miracle. Because when you strip it all back, the silk sheets, the lace nightgowns, the ash-dusted chimneys, you find the same core desire: comfort. Something alive, something warm, something yours. And yes, they were mostly kept by women. Not because men hated hedgehogs, though honestly some did, but because hedgehogs symbolize something profoundly gendered in Edwardian culture: a retreat from performative roles into something private and personal. Think of it this way: Edwardian women were expected to manage appearances. Hair posture, smile glove color, voice pitch. Even their sleep routines were policed. Early health manuals had pages titled things like "The Proper Attire and Attitude of a Slumbering Lady." Hint, it didn't include a hedgehog or snoring. So when a woman slipped under the covers clutching not a prayer book or perfume sachet, but a snorting, bristly mammal with a penchant for beetles, it was a rebellion in miniature. A form of gendered escapism that sidestepped expectations entirely. And while middle-class women might have framed it in the language of delicate nerves and therapeutic zoology, working-class women didn't need that. Their hedgehogs weren't wellness statements. They were necessities, like extra socks, or secret tea money, or knowing how to patch a hole without anyone noticing. And let's not forget, many of these women didn't live alone. They shared rooms, sometimes beds. They worked 12-hour shifts and came home to noise mess and zero personal space. In that context, a hedgehog wasn't just a comfort, it was a boundary, a soft, spiny no-entry sign. A woman with a hedgehog in her bed had carved out something sacred, a tiny sphere of quiet, a bit of warmth she didn't know anyone else. And that matters, Because when you look at the wider sweep of Edwardian domestic life, so much of it was about uncontainment. Roles, rules, routines. Women were boxed in, taught to box others in, and expected to smile through it. But the hedgehog, it was ungovernable. It snorted, it pooped in the corner, it bit ankles. It refused to be cute on command. And yet it was loved. Not despite those traits, but because of them. That's a pretty radical idea in a society that prizes perfection. So tonight, as Buttons reorients himself near your ribs and lets out the faintest sneeze, take a moment to appreciate this strange little intersection of class, gender, and rebellion. Because whether you would have been born to silver spoons or soup kitchens, there's a version of you somewhere, sometime, who would have needed a hedgehog just the same. And who would have risked disapproval, rolled eyes, and possibly a fine from the Housing Sanitation Committee for the right to sleep soundly beside one. You stir, slightly half aware, as Buttons does a little spin near your elbow, his claws ticking against the sheet like a soft wind-up toy. He's probably looking for the edge of the blanket, or that one warm spot he's claimed as his sovereign territory. You shift accommodate, and he settles. And with that, you're right where you need to be to unravel one of the oddest, most delightful offshoots of the entire Edwardian hedgehog phenomenon. The bedtime accessories market. Yes, that's real. There was an entire subculture of hedgehog-themed or hedgehog-accommodating paraphernalia quietly booming between 1901 and 1910. Think of it like Etsy if Etsy had been run by Victorian milliners and overly ambitious sewing clubs. At first it was informal. Women made tiny quilts for their hedgehogs. Crochet circles passed around patterns for prickle pockets. Little cloth pouches lined with flannel where your hedgehog could snooze comfortably. Some even stitched initials into their hedgehog wraps just in case Buttons got loose at a house party and mingled with another woman's spiny bedmate. But soon commerce got involved. Enterprising seamstresses began offering custom hedgehog hammocks, often discreetly advertised in the back pages of home magazines, under names like Sleepy Critter Wraps or Pocket Nestlings. The more adventurous, even crafted miniature nightcaps, mostly ornamental, often ridiculed by the hedgehogs themselves. One London milliner, more famous for ostrich feather hats than rodents, famously released a line of what she dubbed chambre de hérisson. It included hedgehog bedding sets, tiny sleep baskets, and even a bejeweled enclosure called the Slumber Grotto, complete with velvet curtains and a water dish shaped like a Roman urn. Historians still argue whether that one was parody or sincere. She did sell 6, but the crown jewel of this fad, the hedgebed, it began as a joke in a small satirical magazine featuring a sketch of a hedgehog snuggled into a mahogany-framed doll's bed, complete with lace canopy and a tiny copy of Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management beside the pillow. What was meant to be humorous became aspirational. Soon, middle-class women were commissioning miniature 4-poster beds for their hedgehogs, often from the same carpenters who made doll furniture or baby cribs. If you were very proper and very determined, you could own a hedge bed in walnut lined with pink taffeta with matching curtains. A few even had initials carved into the headboard, BGH for Beatrice's Good Hedgehog, or just Darla. The accessories weren't only about spoiling the animals. They were statements. Owning a well-kitted-out hedgehog was proof of refined domesticity and whimsical rebellion. It said, I care enough to be excellent and weird enough not to be boring. Even the magazines got involved. The Ladies' Companion, Godey's Penny Weekly, and other household favorites began publishing hedgehog features, usually nestled between recipes for blancmange and tips for morning wear. One reader submission read, I have found that young Nell, our hog, prefers a sachet of hops beneath her chin and tolerates only Irish linen. We attempted a silk blend, but she expressed her distaste by chewing a corner and urinating on the trim. Another article solemnly advised, a lavender-stuffed pillow calms the nerves of both lady and beast, though take care too strong a scent and your hog will attempt escape. There was even a moment brief but glorious when a certain tea company tried to launch a hedgehog-themed bedtime blend. The ad showed a hedgehog snoozing in a cup, and the tagline was as soothing as a hog in a basket. It flopped, but the image lives on in the archives. Of course, not everyone was thrilled by the trend. Conservative critics derided the accessories as a sign of declining morals and frivolous womanhood. One grumpy letter to a newspaper railed, first cats and prams, now hogs and hammocks. What's next? Guinea pigs in Parliament? Historians still argue whether this backlash stemmed from genuine concern or the usual discomfort with women doing whatever they wanted. Because really, that's what this was. All of it, the pouches, the lace, the gilded mini furniture, was agency dressed in calico. A hedgehog wasn't just a pet, it was a declaration: I will decide what matters in my space. And maybe in a society that couldn't fathom women sleeping alone unless they were either fallen or infirm, a well-dressed hedgehog was the perfect distraction. Because no one was asking, why is Miss Cartwright still unmarried at 36? They were too busy wondering, did you see the pom-pom trimmed hedge blanket she had made in Paris? And that, dear listener, is what we call a deflection of genius. So tonight, as Buttons makes a soft, wheezing hiccup and disappears beneath your pillowcase, like a migrating sock, take a moment to honor all those Edwardian women who carved and cross-stitched their way to hedgehog harmony. Because it wasn't just about sleeping soundly, it was about crafting a world where that sleep and that softness was finally in their terms. And really, don't you wish someone would bring back the hedge bed? No, okay, maybe just the sachets then. You're not sure what woke you. Maybe it was Buttons shifting his weight on your chest, or maybe your mind just decided to bubble back up from sleep because, well, there's still more story to tell. And tonight that story takes a turn toward the strange, the deeply strange. Because, dear listener, you've earned the right to hear about the spiritualists. Yes, the psychics, the mediums, the tea leaf readers, and the soft-spoken women who claim to channel messages from beyond the veil, and who, for a brief and baffling moment in Edwardian history, decided hedgehogs were more than just snoring bedwarmers. They were spiritual conduits. Let's rewind a little. The early 1900s were a golden age for spiritualism. Seances weren't just things you did on rainy Tuesday nights for fun. They were fashionable, intellectual even. Everyone from duchesses to depressed vicars dipped a toe into the ethereal waters. And spiritualism had one major advantage over traditional religion women were allowed to lead. In parlors across London and rural backwaters alike, women conducted seances, read auras, and claimed to host spirits through automatic writing. And because the cosmos apparently has a wicked sense of humor, a surprising number of these women also had hedgehogs. Why Minanas? Well, for one, hedgehogs were thought to have a foot in two worlds. They lived close to the earth, burrowing, listening. They were nocturnal, mysterious, silent but watchful. And in folklore, especially European peasant tales, hedgehogs had long been seen as creatures of a second sight. One Bavarian story claimed hedgehogs could smell dishonesty. A Polish myth suggested they could whisper dreams into sleepers' ears. And in several old texts from rural Ireland, hedgehogs were said to carry messages between fairy realms and the waking world. So when Miss Thistlewhite of Kent claimed her hedgehog, Eloise could predict who would marry next based on which guest she curled up near. During tea, you better believe people paid attention. And not just with amusement, with money. Eloise became something of a local celebrity. The Kent Gazette called her the Oracle of Needle Street. She was fed apple slices by gloved hands and brought in for drawing room performances where she waddled over silk tablecloths and selected a card from a tarot spread. And she wasn't alone. Across the country, similar stories popped up. Hedgehogs attending seances, hedgehogs placed in the center of chalk circles, hedgehogs kept beside crystal balls and scrying bowls. One particularly dramatic woman in Bristol claimed her hedgehog Ophelia had shivered violently just minutes before the Titanic sank. Historians still argue whether that was a fabricated tale or just a hedgehog reacting to someone slamming a cupboard. Even Queen Alexandra, yes, that. Queen Alexandra was rumored to have visited a medium who used a hedgehog during her trance sessions. The claim was never verified, of course, and the palace denied it. But in the sleepy undercurrent of gossip and parlor talk, the rumor stuck. Which raises the question, were these hedgehogs really channeling cosmic wisdom? Or was it just another performance, one more way Edwardian women used the unexpected to regain control over their lives? Because make no mistake, in these spiritualist spaces, women were in charge. They weren't just bringing hedgehogs to bed. They were using them as tools of power, domestic, symbolic, and yes, occasionally ridiculous. And the men, they were spectators. Curious sometimes, skeptical, occasionally impressed, but always on the outside of the mystery. That was part of the appeal. Think about it. The rest of society was rigid class hierarchies, gender roles, corsets, and curfews. But here, lit by candles ringed by salt one eye on the twitchy hedgehog in the center of the floor, women held court. Was it a hoax? Often. Was it effective? Who knows? Was it fun? Absolutely. There's a half-disintegrated pamphlet from 1906 titled Whispers in the Hedge, self-published by a woman who called herself Sister Araminta. In it, she writes, "The hedgehog is the sacred spiral, the root of old wisdom. He comes to us when the night is thick and the veil is thin. Treat him kindly, and he shall guard your sleep as well as your secrets." No one knows if Araminta was serious or simply very bored in a rural village. But she wasn't alone in thinking the hedgehog was more than just a lump under the duvet. Because for every woman using one to soothe her cramps or warm her toes, another was quietly placing a silver ring on its spines and whispering, "Tell me who waits beyond the veil." And here's the thing, it doesn't really matter whether Buttons here is channeling the ghost of your great-uncle Gerald or just dreaming about mealworms. What matters is that for Edwardian women navigating a world full of limitation and loss, a hedgehog became a gateway. To rest, to mystery, to laughter, to something else. Something ungoverned, something outside the reach of rules. So tonight, as Buttons gives a half-hearted sneeze and burrows deeper beneath your arm, picture those seances. The hush, the giggle, the candlelight flickering off a tiny snout. And remember, your bedtime companion was once part of a magical resistance. Spiny, sacred, slightly smelly, but powerful all the same. There's a stillness now, the kind that creeps in when the air has cooled, when the night feels deeper than usual, like it's swallowed up all the clocks. Buttons is dreaming again. His paws twitch against your forearm, slow and rhythmic, like he's running through something familiar. Maybe a hedgehog fairground. Maybe just a never-ending field of grubs. And while he rests, you get to follow the trail of the women who took this trend. Well overseas. Yes, hedgehogs didn't just stay curled up in Edwardian bedrooms across England. They went abroad, and not just as curiosities or pets, but as little ambassadors of a quietly subversive lifestyle. They boarded steamships, rode in train compartments, and peeked out from wicker baskets at customs stations from Calais to Calcutta. It all started with the travel boom. Between 1901 and 1910, more upper and middle-class British women were traveling than ever before. Some were tourists trailing their way through the Alps or posing for photos at the pyramids. Others were teachers, nurses, or missionary workers bound for distant colonies. A few were part of the archaeological or anthropological scene, less Indiana Jones, more wide-eyed with notebooks and very sensible boots. But wherever they went, one strange pattern kept showing up in journals, letters, and the odd shipping manifest. The hedgehogs came with them. Historians still argue whether this practice was mostly symbolic, a nod to home, a comfort object thing, or something more practical like having a mobile heat source in damp or drafty places. Either way, the image is incredible. Imagine a tired nurse arriving in South Africa, unpacking her books, her letters, her medicine chest, and her sleepy hedgehog who's blinking slowly in the tropical sunlight like, what happened to Surrey? One woman, Miss Dorothea Brinksley, was famous in missionary circles for never going anywhere without her hedgehog Percival. She brought him to Kenya, to Egypt, even to northern India. There's a surviving photo of her in full starched uniform, standing beside a tent with Percival nestled in a fold of her apron, looking deeply unimpressed by colonial life. But perhaps the oddest story belongs to a woman named Eliza Rathbone. Eliza, a botanist from York, with a fondness for pressed flowers and unwashed hair, took a hedgehog with her on a 3-month field expedition through the Pyrenees. She named him Admiral Butterbottom. Her diary, which survives in a dusty university archive, describes how she used the hedgehog as both foot warmer and conversation starter. French peasants were most enchanted. One brought cheese, another a goose. The hedgehog dined better than I. The hedgehog's ability to charm and disarm was part of its strange power. You could be a lone woman in a very unfamiliar land, and the moment you pulled a tiny spiky mammal from your travel satchel, the mood shifted. People smiled. Curiosity replaced suspicion. Suddenly, you weren't a threat, you were the strange but lovable British lady with a funny animal. Of course, there were disasters. Hedgehogs are not, generally speaking, excellent travelers. They are creatures of habit, of corners, of predictable sleep rhythms. So when one woman accidentally let hers loose in a rail car outside Prague, chaos followed. The poor thing vanished under the seats, causing a minor panic. A Hungarian priest tripped over a valise. A dog howled. The conductor had to stop the train. Another traveler lost hers entirely in Naples. Whether it escaped was stolen or joined a rogue gang of Italian hedgehogs is still unknown. But the point is, these creatures made it far beyond their native hedgerows. And that had effects no one expected. In several French and German periodicals from the early 1910s, there are puzzled editorials about les femmes anglaises et leurs hérissons. Mostly they treated it as quirky national behavior like cucumber sandwiches or fox hunting. But a few were fascinated. One French writer called the trend un geste de solitude féminine, a gesture of feminine solitude. He meant it as a compliment. Because here's what's quietly radical about a woman bringing a hedgehog on a boat to another continent. She was taking her comfort with her, not relying on a man or a church or a government quartermaster. Just packing up her preferred bedtime companion, prickly, odd, stubborn, and hitting the road. It's a move that said, I don't need to ask permission to be comforted. And in a world where women were still being told what rooms they could enter, what hours they could keep, what futures they could shape, that's a bold little act. Even in fiction, the symbol started to spread. One obscure 1909 novel, The Diary of Minerva Plum, features a hedgehog named Titus who travels with the heroine to Constantinople. He's there for comic relief mostly, but there's a scene where Minerva sleeps on a rooftop wrapped in blankets, her arms around Titus whispering, "The stars fall, little one, I hope one lands on you gently." That one line got quoted in several women's magazines in the years that followed. It resonated, because even if most readers had never touched a real hedgehog, they understood the feeling wanting something soft and silent beside you in a world full of loud demands. So whether it was in a country manor or a colonial outpost, a second-class rail car or a rooftop under the Ottoman sky, the hedgehog remained constant, a totem, a friend, a private ritual, a whisper to the world that says, I sleep on my terms. And maybe in your own way, you're doing the same tonight. It's almost morning now. The air is cool but not cold soft, with the kind of hush that only comes when the rest of the world hasn't noticed the time. Buttons hasn't moved in a while. His snout is tucked beneath your wrist, warm and still. And if he's dreaming, it must be a quiet one. And you're still here, still wrapped up in the strangest bedtime story. No one ever warned you about the tale of Edwardian women and their hedgehogs. And we've come to the final layer of it all, the afterglow. See, it wasn't just a passing fad. Not really. These women didn't simply pick up hedgehogs like accessories, then abandon them when something shinier came along. Many of them, especially those outside the upper crust, kept the creatures for years. Through marriages, through wars, through bitter winters and long recoveries. Some even passed them on. Not literally, of course. Hedgehogs aren't known for their robust lifespans. But the tradition of keeping a small warm creature close at night, that lingered. Mothers told daughters. Aunts sent letters. In one Glasgow family, a great-granddaughter of an Edwardian hedgehog owner told a journalist in the 1960s, Gran always said, if you can sleep with something warm curled near your ribs, the world can't ever quite break you. And there's something beautiful in that. But even beauty has to change shape with time. By the 1920s, the world was shifting fast. The First World War had cracked the old order apart. Aristocratic estates were crumbling, women were working in offices and factories, and fashion had done away with corsets and petticoats in favor of cloche hats and brisk bobbed hair. The hedgehogs somehow didn't keep up. Not because people stopped loving them, but because the symbol no longer fit. The act of taking one to bed had once been quiet rebellion, a slow burn resistance wrapped in wool blankets and lavender. But by the roaring 20s, rebellion looked different. It wore lipstick, smoked cigarettes, danced to jazz, and didn't need a hedgehog to make a point. Still, traces lingered. Children's books continued to feature hedgehogs in nightcaps tucked into teacups and drawer beds. Rural women still swore by them as pest control and weather forecasters. And among the elderly, the hedgehog remained a creature of comfort, even if no one dared tuck one into bed anymore. Historians still argue whether the entire phenomenon was ever as widespread as the anecdotes suggest. Were there truly hundreds of hedgehog-sleeping Edwardian ladies across Britain, or just a few dozen inflated by rumor echoed through generations? Does it matter? Because even if it only happened a handful of times, those moments existed. Tiny worlds closed off by curtains and soft breathing, where a woman reclaimed just a little warmth for herself, no explanations, no permissions needed. And that's why the story endures. Not because it's practical or universal or medically recommended. Please don't try this without vet approval. But because it offers a tiny glimpse into an old overlooked kind of power. The power of choosing softness, of sleeping beside something gentle, of defying the cold. And tonight you've walked that whole path, boots crunching through Edwardian snowbank's ears, twitching to the tick of gas lamps, eyes squinting at spiritualist pamphlets and railway tickets and pressed flowers. You've met women who bent the rules in the most unexpected way possible, by curling up with a hedgehog. And now, as the final thread unspools, it's your turn to carry the story forward. You don't need a hedgehog, not really. You just need something or someone to remind you that rest is an act of rebellion and comfort doesn't have to be loud to be radical. So slip a hand beneath your pillow. Listen to the hush, breathe deep and long and slow. And as we fade into the wind down, let's end where all good stories should, on the edge of dreaming. Let it all go now. The candles, the corsets, the scratch of wool on bare arms. Let buttons drift off somewhere far and foggy where apple cores grow on trees and no one ever has to wake up early. Breathe out through your nose. Feel your weight sink just a little deeper into the mattress. There's no more history to chase tonight, just the warm echo of it, like a lullaby you almost remember. The world with all its noise and edges can wait. Because here it's just you in the dark, soft and safe and slow. Let your thoughts drift, not in sentences, but in shapes. Wool blankets, steam curling off tea, a tiny paw pressed to your chest. No questions, no facts to memorize, just sensations. The stillness of a frost-lined window, the tick of a clock, the faint scent of soap and something old lavender maybe, or the trace of a pine fire. Every breath you take now, make it slower than the last. Let your muscles uncoil. Let the silence grow longer. And if a tiny creature rustles in your imagination, spiny, gentle, half asleep, don't push it away. Just smile and scoot over. Make space in your story. There's always room for warmth. And now it's time. Close your eyes, friend. You've earned your rest. One end of script. Sweet dreams.